The price of betrayal, love, lost in a moment. John and Claire had been married for 10 years. Their love story wasn't unlike any other. They met through mutual friends, shared a whirlwind romance, and eventually walked down the aisle, promising to stand by each other through thick and thin. They bought a beautiful home in the suburbs, built lives that revolved around each other, and had plans for a family, though that hadn't materialized yet. From the outside, they appeared the perfect couple, successful, happy, and in love. But John felt the strain long before he could put a finger on it. Life had a way of making things complicated. His work at a growing tech startup demanded more of his time. Claire's job as a marketing executive kept her busy with constant meetings and travel. Their lives had become a blur of work schedules, quick dinners, and occasional late nights. The small things that used to matter, movie nights, spontaneous road trips, and shared laughter, faded into the background of their busy existence. John noticed Claire's behavior changing subtly over the months. At first, it was just little things. She started locking her phone, something she never used to do. She became more secretive about her whereabouts, her explanations growing vaguer every time she came home late. And there were the absences, weekends where she claimed she was with friends or at a work retreat, but something about her stories didn't quite add up. John tried to brush it off. He didn't want to believe that anything was wrong. Claire was his wife, after all, the woman he loved more than anything. He wanted to believe that it was just stress or exhaustion driving a wedge between them, but the gnawing feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. Then one Friday evening, something happened that changed everything. John had been working late again, going over a proposal for an important client. It was around 9 p.m. when his phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Mark, his closest friend. "John, I need to talk to you." Mark was usually lighthearted and rarely serious, so the urgency in his message made John uneasy. He immediately called him back. "What's going on?" John asked, his tone betraying the anxiety he was trying to suppress. Mark hesitated, his voice heavy with hesitation. "Man, I don't know how to tell you this, but I saw Claire tonight. She was at a bar on the other side of town, and she wasn't alone." John's heart froze, his hand gripping the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but she was with a guy, John, and they didn't look like friends. I wasn't going to say anything, but I thought you should know. I didn't want you to be blindsided." The world around John blurred as Mark's words sank in. Claire? With another man? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Mark was his best friend. He had no reason to lie. But still, John didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. Without a word, he hung up the phone, grabbed his car keys, and headed out. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, anger, and dread. He drove through the city in silence, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The streets were busy with nightlife, couples walking hand in hand, groups of friends laughing as they headed to bars and restaurants. John's world felt miles away from that, spinning out of control. When he arrived at the bar, his eyes immediately scanned the room. There, in the far corner, seated at a dimly lit table, was Claire, and across from her was a man John didn't recognize. They were deep in conversation, laughing and smiling in a way that made John's stomach turn. He felt the air leave his lungs. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen, watching them. Claire leaned in closer, her hand brushing the man's arm. It was the kind of touch that spoke volumes, a silent confirmation of what John had feared. She was having an affair. Unable to confront her in that crowded bar, John turned around and left, his heart pounding in his chest. He drove aimlessly through the city for hours, trying to process what he had just seen. His mind was flooded with questions. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't he noticed sooner? Was it something he had done? By the time he finally returned home, it was well past midnight, but Claire wasn't there. She came home the next morning, acting as if nothing was wrong, giving John a peck on the cheek before she busied herself in the kitchen. He watched her carefully, every movement, every word she said, calculating. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but something held him back. He needed time to think, to figure out what his next move would be. Over the next week, John's suspicions only grew. Claire was more distant than ever, her phone constantly buzzing with messages she refused to show him. She left for work trips that seemed to come out of nowhere. The lies piled up, and John could no longer ignore the truth. His wife was living a double life, and he had been too blind to see it. One evening, John finally snapped. It was a Tuesday night, and Claire had come home late again. She slipped into the house quietly, not realizing John was sitting in the darkened living room waiting for her. When she turned on the light, she jumped, surprised to see him there. "John, what are you doing sitting in the dark?" she asked, her voice tense. He stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "We need to talk, Claire." She hesitated, the color draining from her face. "What's going on?" John crossed his arms, his voice cold and calm. I know about the affair." For a moment, she didn't say anything, her face going pale. Then she tried to laugh it off. "What are you talking about? There's no affair." John shook his head, his voice low but filled with anger. "I saw you, Claire, at the bar with that man. You weren't working. You were with him, and I know this has been going on for a while." Claire's facade crumbled in an instant. She looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. "John, I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." John clenched his fists, trying to hold back the rage building inside him. "How long?" "6 months," she whispered, her voice barely audible. 6 months, half a year of lies, deceit, and betrayal. John felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He had been living in a false reality, thinking their problems were just the natural result of stress and work. But all along, Claire had been seeing someone else. "You've been lying to me for 6 months," John said through gritted teeth. "How could you do this?" Claire started crying, but her tears did nothing to soften John's anger. He had heard enough. "I can't do this anymore, Claire. I'm done." With that, John walked upstairs, packed a suitcase, and left the house. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The woman he had married, the woman he had trusted, was gone. She had been replaced by someone he didn't recognize, someone who had thrown away their marriage for an affair. In the days that followed, John met with a lawyer. He collected evidence, phone records, receipts, and anything that could prove Claire's infidelity. He was methodical, almost detached, as if the betrayal had numbed him completely. When Claire was finally served with divorce papers, she tried to reach out to John, but he refused to see her. He didn't want to hear her excuses or her apologies. The damage was done. During the divorce proceedings, John presented everything to the court. The judge ruled in his favor, granting him the house and the majority of their assets. Claire was left with little more than her guilt and the knowledge that she had destroyed their marriage for a man who had already disappeared from her life. As the months passed, John began to rebuild his life. He threw himself into his work, surrounded himself with friends who supported him, and slowly, piece by piece, began to heal. Claire, on the other hand, faded from his world, just a painful memory of a life that no longer existed. In the end, the betrayal had broken John, but it hadn't destroyed him. He had survived, and that was all that mattered. John thought his marriage was built on trust, love, and years of shared memories. But when subtle changes in his wife Claire's behavior raise suspicions, his worst fears are confirmed in a single night. Caught in the web of lies and deceit, John's world shatters as he discovers Claire's 6-month affair. Faced with betrayal and heartbreak, John must navigate the harsh consequences of his wife's infidelity. As their once perfect life crumbles, he embarks on a journey to rebuild himself from the ashes of their broken marriage, uncovering strength in the most painful of circumstances.